March 17, 1943, Berlin, Germany. In a wood-paneled office buried deep within German military headquarters, an admiral stared at a single sheet of paper. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was holding. This wasn't just another intelligence report. This was a death sentence, not for one person, but for an entire nation. The document contained no secret about atomic weapons, no details of a massive invasion force. Instead, it described something far more terrifying: a factory. An American factory located thousands of miles away in a place called Michigan that would soon be capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every single hour. 60 minutes. One complete aircraft. Every hour. Every day. To the military leadership reading this report, it seemed like science fiction. Like enemy propaganda so absurd it belonged in a comic book. But to the intelligence officers who had risked everything to gather this information, it meant something entirely different. It meant the war was already over. Germany just didn't know it yet. This is the story of the most important intelligence report of World War II. A report so accurate, so devastating, that the leadership refused to believe it, and how that refusal to accept reality sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Part 1. The Spy Master Who Saw the Truth. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was not your typical member of the German High Command. As head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he was a man who dealt in facts, not fantasies. While others around him became intoxicated by ideology and propaganda, Canaris remained coldly, almost painfully, rational. He was old school. A career naval officer from an earlier era when patriotism meant serving your country, not a political party. He understood something that many of his colleagues had forgotten. Modern warfare isn't won by willpower or superior fighting spirit alone. It's won by mathematics, by production capacity, by who can build more tanks, more planes, more bullets. And by early 1943, the mathematics were starting to terrify him. The war that had begun with stunning victories was changing. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had shaken everyone. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were pushing back with unexpected strength. In North Africa, Allied forces were closing in. But it wasn't the battles that worried Canaris most. It was something else. Something his network of spies and analysts were reporting from across the Atlantic Ocean. Intelligence reports didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. They came in slowly, like pieces of a puzzle. A businessman returning from America mentioned a factory so large it created its own weather patterns. A diplomat in Washington reported production targets that seemed to have an extra zero, surely a typing error. A Swedish engineer sent a coded message about an assembly line that moved with the precision of automobile manufacturing. Each report, taken alone, could be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. But when dozens of reports from independent sources all told the same story, a pattern emerged. They all pointed to one location, Willow Run, Michigan, and they all made the same impossible claim. Part 2. The Impossible Factory. The Ford Motor Company, yes, the automobile manufacturer, had built a factory unlike anything the world had ever seen, and they were applying car production techniques to something vastly more complex, the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. Let's put this in perspective. A B-24 Liberator wasn't a simple machine. It was an 18-ton monster containing over 1.5 million individual parts. Engines, hydraulics, electrical systems, weapons, navigation equipment, all precisely assembled and calibrated. German factories, considered the pinnacle of European engineering, took weeks or even months to produce a comparable heavy bomber. The process required skilled craftsmen, careful hand assembly, and meticulous quality control. The idea that anyone could mass-produce such a complex weapon in 60 minutes wasn't just unlikely. To German military minds, it was physically impossible. But Canaris' analysts did the calculations anyway. 1 bomber per hour equals 24 per day. That's over 700 per month from a single factory. At the time, the entire German aviation industry was struggling to produce a fraction of that number in heavy bombers. The intelligence was verified through multiple sources. Even Japan, Germany's own ally, was sending back reports on American production numbers. Reports filled with barely concealed alarm. The data was solid. The sources were reliable. The mathematics were undeniable. But how could this be possible? How could a nation that German propaganda mocked as weak, divided, and decadent achieve such a feat? To understand why German leadership couldn't accept this truth, you need to understand their worldview. In their ideology, strength came from racial purity and authoritarian control. America had neither. Therefore, these reports had to be deception. The alternative was too horrifying to consider, that the war was no longer a contest of soldiers or strategy, but a contest of factories. And if these numbers were real, Germany had already lost. As one Abwehr officer quietly noted in his journal, if these figures are accurate, the war is over. This is no longer about courage or tactics. It's about mathematics, and the mathematics are not in our favor. Part 3. The Arsenal of Democracy. Half a world away, the impossible was becoming reality. On a stretch of farmland outside Detroit, Michigan, something extraordinary had been constructed. The Willow Run Bomber Plant was the physical embodiment of what President Roosevelt called the Arsenal of Democracy. Designed by industrial architect Albert Kahn, the main assembly building was a single room so vast it earned a remarkable distinction: the most enormous room in the history of mankind. Think about that for a moment. Not the largest building, the largest single room. It stretched for more than half a mile. The ceiling was so high that clouds occasionally formed inside on humid days. The assembly line was so long that to avoid paying taxes in 2 different counties, it had to make a bizarre 90-degree turn halfway through, with partially built bombers rotating on giant turntables. Workers called it the tax turn. But the real revolution wasn't the size. It was the philosophy. Henry Ford and his production chief, Charles Sorensen, had made what seemed like an arrogant promise. They would build airplanes the same way they built automobiles. The traditional aircraft industry laughed at them. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," one executive scoffed. Ford and Sorensen proved them wrong. They deconstructed the B-24 into manageable subassemblies. They created specialized tools for specific tasks. They trained workers not to be aircraft craftsmen, but to perform single, repetitive operations with extreme precision. One person drilled holes in a specific pattern. Another installed a particular component. Another operated a rivet gun on one section of the fuselage, over and over, all day long. This allowed the plant's training program to take people with zero manufacturing experience and turn them into productive workers in a matter of weeks. And who were these workers? This is where the story becomes truly remarkable, and where it directly contradicted everything the German leadership believed about the world. Part 4. The Workers Who Won the War. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. Nearly 1/3 were women, the famous Rosie the Riveters, who operated rivet guns, welding torches, and heavy machinery. One of these women, Rose Will Monroe, became the real-life inspiration for the Rosie the Riveter propaganda character. She was a young widow with 2 children who went to work building bombers and became an icon. The workforce was remarkably diverse. Over 9% were African American. 3% were classified as disabled. Immigrants from dozens of countries worked side by side. They worked in shifts, 6 days a week. The factory operated 24 hours a day. The collective effort created a constant hum, the sound of democracy mobilizing. This was the mongrel society that German propaganda loved to mock. This was the weak, divided nation that supposedly lacked the discipline and martial spirit necessary for modern warfare. And they were about to outproduce the so-called master race at a rate that defied comprehension. The early months were rough. Problems with the assembly line, quality control issues, and organizational chaos earned the plant an unflattering nickname: Will It Run? But as 1943 progressed, the machine found its rhythm. Raw materials flowed in one end: aluminum sheets, engines, instruments, weapon systems. Out the other, and every 63 minutes, an 18-ton heavy bomber emerged, ready to fly across the Atlantic and into combat. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't exaggeration. This was a new form of warfare that no military theorist had fully anticipated: the industrialized production of destruction on a scale the world had never seen. While German scientists worked on futuristic rocket programs and jet fighters, America had perfected its most devastating weapon of all, the assembly line. Part 5. The Wall of Denial. Armed with this terrifying intelligence, Admiral Canaris faced his greatest challenge: penetrating the wall of denial surrounding German leadership. And the chief architect of that wall was Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. Göring was head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. A decorated World War I pilot, he saw himself as the ultimate authority on air power. He was also spectacularly corrupt, grotesquely egotistical, and increasingly detached from reality. More than anyone, Göring was responsible for the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility. He had promised the German people that enemy bombers would never reach German cities. He had assured leadership that German air superiority was unquestionable. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings on Willow Run, Göring's reaction wasn't concern or alarm. It was laughter. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he famously sneered. "Only our fatherland can do that. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." This wasn't just a throwaway insult. It was a perfect summary of the ideological worldview that would doom Germany. To them, Americans were shopkeepers, not warriors. They were a consumer society obsessed with comfort and luxury. They were a racially mixed nation that lacked the purity and discipline necessary for great achievements. The idea that such a culture could mass-produce heavy bombers was, in Göring's mind, simply impossible. The reports had to be clumsy Allied propaganda designed to intimidate. Imagine how maddening this must have been for Canaris. He was presenting mathematical certainty to a man living in a fantasy world. He tried to press the issue. His agents had specifics: the mile-long assembly line, the specialized tooling, the massive capital investment, the training programs, the production schedules. Göring wouldn't hear it. To accept Canaris's report would be a devastating admission that his own intelligence had missed the most critical development of the war. It would mean his Luftwaffe was about to be swept from the skies by an avalanche of American production. So the report went nowhere. It was buried under Göring's immense ego and ideological blindness. The wall of denial stood firm. Canaris was left holding a truth that could save Germany, but with no one in power willing to listen. The next step was the most dangerous: somehow getting this information to the one man who mattered most. Part 6. The Führer's Fantasy. Presenting unwelcome facts at German headquarters was a strange and dangerous business. Whether at the Berghof in the Alps or the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the atmosphere was oppressive, paranoid, and divorced from reality. Facts were whatever the leadership declared them to be. Military briefings became theater, performances designed to reinforce whatever conclusions had already been reached. Into this environment, the intelligence from Willow Run arrived like a ticking time bomb. The German leader's view of the United States was a bizarre contradiction. He had grudging respect for American size and resources, but total contempt for American culture and society. He saw America as a mongrel nation, weakened by racial diversity and controlled by shadowy financial interests. In his twisted worldview, such a society could never mobilize effectively or achieve greatness. When confronted with the production figures from the Abwehr, projections of 1 bomber per hour over 650 per month from a single factory, the reaction mirrored Göring's, but with even more venom. This wasn't just a strategic assessment being questioned. It was a personal insult to the entire ideological foundation of the regime. The numbers were dismissed as inflated fantasies. Jewish propaganda. American bluffing. Albert Speer, the armaments minister and one of the few people who actually understood industrial production, would later admit in Allied interrogations that he knew the truth. If the Willow Run numbers were even half accurate, Germany was doomed. But to say that openly in 1943 would have been career suicide, or actual suicide. So the Great Confrontation never really happened. When fact collided with dogma in the Third Reich, dogma always won. The Admiral's warning wasn't just ignored. It was seen as evidence of defeatism. The men who brought uncomfortable truths were now suspect. Their patriotism questioned. In the leadership's mind, the war was a test of will and blood, not logistics and production capacity. A single piece of paper, representing the dangerous work of dozens of intelligence agents, was brushed aside. It contained perhaps the most important strategic fact of the entire war. The enemy's industrial capacity was growing at a rate Germany couldn't hope to match. The decision was made not by official order but by stubborn refusal to see reality. The truth was rejected. The spies were dismissed. The Admiral was silenced. And in that moment of supreme ideological blindness, the fate of millions was sealed. Part 7. The Prophecy Fulfilled. The consequences of that denial were inevitable. They came first as a distant rumble, then as a terrifying roar that filled the skies over Germany. Believing their own propaganda, German high command made a series of catastrophic strategic mistakes. They continued pouring resources into prestige projects. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, while technologically impressive, were strategically insignificant. The Messerschmitt Mi-262 jet fighter was revolutionary, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. They didn't have time because the prophecy of Willow Run was coming true. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers became a flood. The U.S. 8th Air Force began its relentless daylight bombing campaign. And at the heart of this campaign were the B-24 Liberators, the planes rolling off that impossible assembly line in Michigan. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, an all-out assault on German aircraft production facilities. Thousands of bombers, many from Willow Run, pounded factories across Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to defend and was systematically destroyed. German pilots, however brave and skilled, were simply overwhelmed by numbers. For every German fighter lost, there was only a trickle of replacements. For every American plane destroyed, 10 more were crossing the Atlantic. It was brutal arithmetic, exactly what Canaris had foreseen. The cities Göring had promised would never be bombed were being reduced to rubble. A frustrated Luftwaffe general wrote in his diary, "The Reich Marshal lives in fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed our factories. He still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft." The B-24s that rolled out of the most enormous room in the history of mankind were now systematically dismantling the Third Reich piece by piece. They shattered factories, destroyed railways, obliterated oil refineries. The German war machine, starved of fuel and replacement equipment, began grinding to a halt. The once unstoppable forces were being pounded into submission by the output of a single factory their leaders had laughed at. Part 8. The Price of Truth. So what happened to the man who tried to sound the alarm? For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of telling the truth was steep. As the war turned against Germany, his sober warnings marked him as unreliable. In an increasingly paranoid leadership environment, being a realist looked a lot like being a traitor. His rivals saw the Abwehr as a nest of old-world officers who lacked true ideological fervor. They watched him closely, waiting for a mistake. His accurate reports on American industry weren't just dismissed. They were seen as proof that Canaris himself was spreading enemy propaganda. He was trapped. To do his job properly was to appear disloyal. But Canaris's opposition went deeper than just presenting unwelcome facts. Horrified by the regime's atrocities, he used the Abwehr to shield members of the German resistance, including theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He secretly worked to keep Spain from joining the conflict, an act of quiet sabotage that cost Germany dearly. The final blow came after the failed July 20, 1944 attempt on the leader's life. The investigation that followed uncovered vast networks of internal opposition, and many trails led to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested. His personal diaries were discovered, revealing the true depth of his opposition to the regime. On April 9, 1945, in the final chaotic weeks of the war, the order came down. At Flossenburg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was executed in a particularly cruel manner. It was a brutal, humiliating end for a man who had seen the future with perfect clarity. He was eliminated by the very regime he had tried to save from its own blindness. He delivered the message, and for his trouble, he was erased. Part 9. The Final Numbers. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the final production numbers proved just how right Canaris had been. The report that landed on his desk in March 1943 wasn't just accurate, it was actually conservative. The final tally for Willow Run was staggering. At its absolute peak in 1944, the plant was producing a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. By the time the last plane rolled off the line in June 1945, Ford had built 6,972 complete B-24s at Willow Run, plus another 1,193 knockdown kits for assembly at other locations. Think about that. A single American factory produced more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aircraft industry managed during the entire war. It wasn't even close. Across all its factories, the United States produced over 18,400 B-24 Liberators, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. In total, from 1940 to 1945, the United States manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft of all types. Germany, in the same period, produced approximately 94,000 combat aircraft. American industrialist William Knudsen summarized it perfectly. We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production the like of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible. The German failure wasn't a failure of intelligence gathering. Their spies did their jobs brilliantly. They got accurate information. The failure was a failure of acceptance, a total cognitive collapse at the highest levels of leadership, an inability to process facts that contradicted deeply held beliefs. The leadership, blinded by their own ideology and propaganda, simply couldn't believe the numbers. They were defeated not by a secret weapon, but by simple arithmetic. They were buried by an avalanche of aluminum and steel, forged by the very people they had dismissed as inferior, men and women of all backgrounds, working together in a free society. The spies were right. The Admiral was right. March 17, 1943 was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, and nobody in power was willing to listen. Closing. The lesson for today. This story shows us that history often turns on moments far from the battlefield, in quiet offices where a single piece of paper can change everything. The story of Willow Run isn't just a fascinating World War II fact. It's a chilling examination of how any government, any organization or even any individual can be blinded by what they want to believe. The Third Reich wasn't defeated for lack of information. It was defeated because its leaders chose to trust their prejudices over facts. They built their worldview on the foundation of ideological mythology, and when the tide of mathematical reality came crashing in, the entire structure washed away. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim reports and the arrogant dismissals of leadership was a battle for reality itself, a battle between evidence and fantasy. Fantasy won the argument, and in doing so, doomed the entire enterprise. Willow Run, meanwhile, stands as a monument to something the regime wanted to destroy: the power of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale that rigid authoritarianism could never match. The factory floor was a microcosm of the Allied cause, a chaotic, inefficient, beautiful mixture of humanity that, when united, achieved what seemed impossible. The legacy of that day in March 1943 echoes through time. It's a stark reminder that the most formidable walls aren't made of concrete and steel. They're the ones we build in our own minds. When we refuse to accept uncomfortable truths, when we dismiss facts that contradict our beliefs, when we surround ourselves with people who only tell us what we want to hear, we're repeating the same fatal mistake. History doesn't care about our ideologies or our pride. It only cares about the facts. And the facts always win in the end.